Have you ever like tried to use one of those, really bad photocopies? The kind where like the ink is all faded and you can barely make out the lines?
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's like you can almost see what it's supposed to be, but the details are so blurry.
It's amazing how our brains try to fill in the blanks, right? Like, we instinctively want to make sense of things, even if it means we end up getting the wrong idea.
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, believe it or not, because that whole blurry photocopy thing, it's actually a pretty good analogy for how some of the most advanced AI out there,
Yeah.
stuff like ChatGPT, actually works.
Really? That's
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah, so we're doing a deep dive today on large language models, LLMs. And we've got some really interesting sources to dig into. There's this article that compares LLMs to blurry photocopies, which is what made me think of it. And then there's this paper on, get this, the dangers of something called stochastic parrots.
Stochastic parrots. Now, that's a phrase I haven't heard before.
Right. And we're also going way back to, like, the dawn of computing with Alan Turing's thoughts on thinking machines. Plus, a paper on this very early language model called ELIZA.
So we're covering a lot of ground here.
We are. But the cool thing is all of these sources, they come together to paint this bigger picture of, like, what LLMs are, how they work, where they go wrong.
And what it all means for us, right? Because we're relying on this technology more and more.
Exactly. So you're telling me that ChatGPT, this thing that can write me a song 1 minute and debug my code the next, it's all based on the same principle as a bad office photocopy.
In a way, yeah. To understand why, we have to think about how these LLMs are trained. It's all about data, massive amounts of data. We're talking text and code scraped from the entire internet, billions of words, like entire libraries worth of information.
So they basically read, like, everything ever written. No wonder they seem so smart.
Well, not exactly. See, that's the thing. They don't actually read and understand the way that we do. Instead, they're looking for patterns and regularities in all that data. Imagine, like, compressing the entire internet into a tiny file.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot of compression. Someone's got to give, right? You can't just cram all that info into a tiny space.
You got it. And that's where our blurry photocopy analogy comes in. Because to compress that much data, you have to make choices about what to keep, what to toss, and what you can kind of try to reconstruct later on.
So some information gets lost or, like, distorted along the way.
Exactly. Just like with that faded photocopy, things get a little fuzzy.
So instead of truly understanding the meaning, it's more like they're, mastering the grammar of the internet, figuring out which words tend to go together, but not necessarily grasping the meaning behind them.
Yeah, you've got it. It's like they've memorized the dictionary and this massive book of grammar rules, but haven't actually read any of the books that use those words. They can create sentences that are grammatically correct and sound really sophisticated.
But it's all just based on these statistical patterns, not real comprehension.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're masters of language, but not necessarily of meaning. And that's where things can get a little,
A little risky. Yeah. A little risky. It's like, what's a good analogy? Okay, imagine you're making a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Eventually, all those little imperfections, they start to add up, and you end up with something that's, like, noticeably different from the original.
Right.
Except with LLMs, those imperfections, they can be, well,
Kind of scary.
they can be, yeah. Because think about it, the data these things are trained on, it's massive, right? A snapshot of the entire internet, basically.
And the internet isn't exactly known
Yeah.
for being, like, the most accurate place in the world.
Exactly. And that's where this whole stochastic parrots thing comes in.
Okay, yeah, before we go any further, can we break that down a bit? Stochastic parrots. It's catchy, I'll give it that, but what does it actually mean?
Right. So stochastic, it basically means random or based on probability. Like, think about flipping a coin.
Okay.
You can't predict exactly which way it'll land, heads or tails, right? There's a chance it could be either.
Right.
So these LLMs, they're generating text based on probabilities too, which words are most likely to follow each other, given what they've seen in all that data.
So it's kind of like they're rolling a really, really complex set of dice to decide what to say next.
Exactly. A
Yeah.
very complex set of dice, and each roll is influenced by, like, everything on the internet they've ever encountered.
Okay, I'm starting to see where the parrot part comes in. They're mimicking what they've seen, but not necessarily understanding it.
Right. And here's the thing, that data they're trained on, it's got all sorts of stuff in it, good, bad, you name it. All the biases, the misinformation, the weird stuff that ends up online. It's all in there.
Oh, man. So it's like garbage in, garbage out.
Kind of, yeah. If the data itself is flawed, the LLM can inherit those flaws, even amplify them.
And that's where things get a little,
Dangerous.
dangerous, yeah. Because we're talking about really powerful technology here. And if it's reflecting back all the worst parts of ourselves.
That's a recipe for disaster, yeah.
So what do we do about it? I mean, is it even possible to create an LLM that's not going to be biased?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? The authors of that Stochastic Parrots paper, they argue that a big part of it is being a lot more careful about what we feed these LLMs in the first place.
So instead of just giving them everything, it's got to be more curated. Like making sure the data itself is as neutral and balanced as possible.
Exactly. It's about quality over quantity. And that requires, some serious thought about what we want these LLMs to learn, what we want them to be able to do.
Because otherwise, we end up with these super powerful AI tools that are just perpetuating all the same problems we're trying to get rid of.
Exactly. And this is actually where, believe it or not, Alan Turing's work comes in.
Really? The guy who basically invented computer science was thinking about, biased AI back then.
Well, maybe not biased AI specifically, but he was thinking about the responsibility that comes with creating powerful new technologies.
Right. He was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
He was. And, in his writing, he talks about how if we manage to create machines that can really think.
And we're getting closer and closer every day, it seems like.
We are, yeah. But Turing's point was that if we do pull it off, we also inherit a huge responsibility for what those machines do, for how they impact the world.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly. And part of that responsibility is making sure they're not just powerful, but also
Ethical.
ethical, yeah. And that brings us to Eliza, actually.
Okay, how does a chatbot from, the 60s fit into all of this?
Yeah.
Well, Eliza, wasn't that the chatbot that people thought was a real therapist or something?
Yeah. Well, some people. Anyway, it's funny. Eliza was actually a pretty simple program. Surprisingly simple, given how much buzz it generated.
Right. So how'd they do it? How'd they make a computer program back then that could fool people like that?
Well, it all came down to clever programming. Basically, Eliza used pattern matching to carry on a conversation. It would look for keywords in what you typed and then generate a response based on those keywords.
So, if I said, I'm feeling sad today, Eliza would pick up on the word sad and then...
Exactly. It might say something like, you're feeling sad. Can you tell me more about that? Or why do you think you're feeling sad today? Very Rogerian therapist vibes.
Right. Just reflecting it back, getting you to open up more.
Exactly. And the thing is, even though it was all just smoke and mirrors, code designed to mimic human conversation, it actually worked. People felt heard, understood even, which is, kind of wild when you think about it.
It is kind of wild, but it also seems relevant to, everything we've been talking about today.
Yeah.
Because these LLMs, they're obviously way more advanced than Eliza ever was.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Light years ahead. But there are some interesting parallels. Eliza showed us how easily we can be drawn in by a machine that can mimic human conversation, even if that conversation is pretty superficial.
Right. And we're wired to find meaning in language, right? Even when it's not really there.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to remember, with LLMs especially, fluency doesn't equal intelligence. Just because an LLM can write a convincing speech or carry on a coherent conversation.
It doesn't mean it understands what it's saying.
Exactly. It's still just a machine following instructions, generating text based on the patterns it's learned.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it feels like we're at this, crossroads with AI. It has so much potential for good, but there are also all these risks.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I don't think there are any easy answers, but I do think awareness is key. The more we understand about how these LLMs work, where they excel, and where they can go wrong, the better equipped we'll be to navigate this new landscape.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. And with LLMs especially, we need to be informed consumers. So don't take everything you see at face value,
Right. Don't believe everything you read on the internet.
Exactly. And that goes double for anything generated by an AI.
So to wrap things up, it sounds like what you're saying is LLMs are powerful tools that can do amazing things, but buyer beware.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Buyer beware. And be thoughtful, be aware of the limitations, think critically, ask questions, and never forget that at the end of the day, these are just tools. Powerful tools, but tools nonetheless. And it's up to us to use them responsibly.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If people in the 1960s were pouring their hearts out to a chatbot that was basically just a clever parlor trick, what does that say about us? What will we be willing to believe from the much more sophisticated AI of the future? Until next time, keep diving deep.